And now it's time to dig deeper into the stories of the week. European efforts to help Ukraine are in the spotlight. I'm now joined by Sir Robin Niblett, Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House. Hello, good evening, and thanks for joining us on World News.
Pleasure.
Yes, now first I'd like to start with the collapse of the Istanbul talks. Based on how far the two sides are apart from each other in various issues, what do you think is next there for the war in Ukraine?
Sadly, I think what's there next is continued fighting. I think from the Russian standpoint, there's a sense that over this summer they can make more gains. The one thing, obviously, they're keeping their eye on is the US Congress. Donald Trump can be a very unpredictable person to have in any negotiation, whether he's on your side or not. But to the extent that Donald Trump starts to withdraw his and his administration's interest in the negotiations, then the US Congress will step forward. And the US Congress has historically been much, much more anti-Russian than you would think from a Republican group that supports Donald Trump. In the last administration, they increased US sanctions on Russia during the first Trump administration, despite Donald Trump wanting to improve relations. So we could end up with a standoff not only diplomatically taking place between Ukraine and Russia, but a much more actually active US position to bring pressure on Russia. I'm not sure it'll change anything in Russia's position, but it will mean that the US will be more, if I can call it this way, on Ukraine's side.
Yes, popular belief is that Europe has already cut off the Russian spigot of energy supplies to Europe, but that is hardly the case. There are still many countries taking quite a significant amount of Russian energy supplies. If these sanctions do in fact eventually go through by the US Senate, where does that leave countries in Europe, and just how bad will the sanctions be? Will they actually be levied on friends and allies?
Look, if the US Congress is developing a bill on this, you can have a certain amount of confidence that it will be developed intelligently. It won't be something that is thrown out there as a kind of generic statement, a feel-good statement, as, if I may say, some of the Trump administration's trade policies have done. So the US Congress is very supportive of NATO. It wants to see NATO obviously spend more on its defense, but they're conscious that with the NATO summit upcoming, they need to have the US and Europe's allies, America's allies in Europe, on the same side. So while there might be some pressure put on those European governments that continue to import, in some cases, Russian pipeline oil, very few, but quite a large number of them, Russian gas, especially LNG, which has grown substantially since the sanctions were imposed. I think what you would see is exemptions made for those countries, and that the targets, which after all are China principally, and Iran, and to a certain extent also India, and other countries around the world that are buying large amounts of Russian oil, I think you will find exemptions provided for European allies.
And concerning China, I mean, we've seen how Donald Trump, had this trade war with China, and then they backed off quite a bit, and China really didn't come forward from a position of weakness. So if these sanctions do go through, how is China likely to react to them? I think we have some technical issues. I think we've lost our guest.
I can hear you back again now. I don't know if you can hear me. There was a slight wobble there for a second.
Yes, I was asking about the impact that this would have on China, and how do you think China would react?
Yeah, I got your question. Apologies for that. Look, I think China is in this for the long game. They know they cannot trust the Trump administration for any type of stable negotiation, so they will try to keep the minimal amount of damage on their own economy. The way to do that is to keep threatening and implementing damage on the US economy. But the idea that there'll be there's some big deal out there between the US and China that could be struck, I don't think they believe it's there. They've already experienced, briefly, 145% sanctions. The idea that might be 500% sanctions, at 145%, it doesn't make any difference. So I think China was readying itself for a long trade war with the Trump administration, and will not be deflected if they do end up being the targets of these new congressional sanctions.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is coming to Europe and will likely not attend the Ukraine contact group meeting. The special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, has said that Ukraine's NATO accession is a legitimate concern for Moscow. And now Poland's president-elect has vowed to block the move should it ever take place. Last year at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., we heard that it's not a matter of if, but rather a matter of when Ukraine joins the NATO alliance. What are we likely to hear at this year's NATO summit as far as that is concerned?
Well, given the fact that I think NATO wants to make sure, European members of NATO and Canada want to make sure they do not have a worse relationship with Donald Trump at the end of this, I think the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership is going to be downplayed significantly. It is impossible to make a promise of NATO accession to a country if you're going to call into question America's extended guarantee, whether nuclear or conventional, over all members as a result of it. I'm afraid I take the view where I would be supportive, I am supportive of Ukraine being a member of NATO, but the when is going to be a long time in the future. And the effort in the near term is going to have to be made principally by European countries there to be able to provide real meaningful military support to Ukraine with some quiet backup by the United States. That is much more important, in my opinion, right now than posturing on long-term NATO membership, which after all is not going to help Ukraine in the near term. So if I think that, and I am extremely supportive of Ukraine and of NATO, you can imagine the Trump administration thinks this in spades.
Final question relating to the Polish elections. I mean, here we saw President-elect Karol Nawrocki having a very MAGA-like campaign. Do you believe that these types of attitudes and movements are growing here in Central and Eastern Europe as opposed to other places in Europe? And are Central Europeans more susceptible to such rhetoric?
Well, it's a very big and complicated question. To make a few comments on it. The first thing I would say is that, look, Central and European countries only truly recovered their sovereignty at the end of the Cold War, which is a lot more recent than most European countries who recovered it in 1945. So there is, the end of the Cold War was about recovery of sovereignty, not about burying it in a form of European integration that limits sovereignty. So I think there is a natural instinct across most Central European countries to be skeptical about deeper forms of European integration. With Britain now outside the EU, the pushers of European integration tend to be associated with Germany and France. France is often unpopular because it supports European integration at one level, but loves to keep a lot of sovereignty for itself on the other. And of course, Germany is a country whose strength is always seen somewhat suspiciously, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and especially in parts of the Polish political establishment, not least your new president-elect. So I think that it is inevitable that countries in Central and Eastern Europe are going to be more skeptical about European integration. But whether they become sort of far right in a MAGA sense, this doesn't necessarily have to be connected because in the end, most Central and East European countries are doing very well out of European regional funds, cohesion funds, post-pandemic funds, and money in the end is also incredibly important to far-right or center-right political actors in Central Eastern Europe. So I think, the Poland first language plays to that, instinct about wanting to have greater sovereignty, but I do not think it's going to translate into a sort of collapse of the European Union or any efforts to pull back from it or being pro-US on trade negotiations.
Well, campaign rhetoric, you have to win a campaign, so we'll see how it translates into action. Sir Robin Niblett, always great to have you as Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House. Thanks for the conversation.
My pleasure. Bye.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.